Go to the book of Numbers. It's lesson 10 back there. How would you feel if somebody gave you, just handed it to you, right? Handed you the keys to a mansion on a luscious property, nicely, freshly manicured lawn, perfect landscaping, maybe even a in-ground pool and a bathhouse, jacuzzi on the porch, outdoor grilling area, 42-inch Blackstone. We can go on and on. How would you feel if somebody gave you that? Just hand it to you. Say, here, it's yours. Don't do anything for it. Only then have them criticize you and then speak evil of you. And why does it bother us? To hurt sometimes when we have somebody just simply reject or even criticize a gift that you've given to them. Maybe you re-gifted something in a Secret Santa you got last year to the same person you got it from, and you kind of see the hurt in their eyes a year later, right? Maybe it happened to you. Right? God gave and gave and gave and gave and gave and gave and gave to the Israelites. Right? He's just constantly giving them things, blessing them with stuff. And through the 9 lessons now, however many weeks we've been doing this, how many times have we seen the Israelites thank God for the blessings? Not very many. It's a rare occasion, actually. Most of the time, what did they do? Complain, right? Well, it's not exactly what we wanted. Why'd you bring us here? Most of the time they complain and they even wanted something else. And because of that, in the process, denying the goodness of God, right? And what He's blessed them with. We're going to look at some more of that today. This lesson, God is, if I get over to the next slide so we can see what it's called, I am the gracious giver. We're going to see God being the gracious giver here. And it's going to help us to see the graciousness of God's heart. Not that we don't know that and realize that, but I think even sometimes us as Christians maybe kind of take God for granted and just with what He's blessed us with. And maybe to learn, maybe to identify and embrace just exactly how much God has graced us with in our lives. Blessed us with, most of us got up, had clothes to put on this morning, probably something to eat, coffee to brew, got up to have a bed or whatever the case may be. God has graced us with quite a bit and blessed us with quite a bit. And as we look through this, we kind of see, just exactly how gracious God was to the Israelites, and then how it's a reminder to us to be thankful for what God has given us. Okay, there was a little activity they wanted us to do. This is obviously a pre-Corona book. They wanted us to get in groups of 4 or 5 and talk about bad experiences while traveling on vacation destinations. We can't do that. We can't even get groups of 4 or 5. That's against regulations. But we've all had probably some bad experiences on some vacations. Traveling to maybe certain destinations, maybe things just didn't turn out quite like you wanted them to. Maybe had a different experience than you thought you were going to have. And just to give you, I guess, one of ours, when Haley and I went on our honeymoon to Cancun, we had never been out of the country before. We had done some traveling, but never been out of the country. It really wasn't what I call a bad experience, but when we touched down in Cancun there in Mexico and got off the airport, and we heard some horror stories about what the airport looked like in Mexico, dirt floors and all these different things. It wasn't. It was pretty, and it looked like an airport. But when we stepped off the airport and was headed to the resort, to see the conditions that some of those people were living in was pretty eye-opening to us. And we were well aware of third world countries and some poverty, but at the place that we stayed, to see those men and women walking to these beautiful resorts on the beach, but see the houses they were coming from as they were walking to work, was a pretty eye-opening experience for us. Of course, we're just going down there for a couple of days for our honeymoon on vacation, kind of doing something we hadn't really done before. These people are living in this, and it was a pretty eye-opening experience for us, just to kind of realize, to me, man, I've really been blessed with a lot. So that was not necessarily a bad circumstance, because we enjoyed our honeymoon and had a good time there. But to see, I guess, something else, to see just essentially, how rough people had it, kind of made me realize the graciousness of God as being in our lives. The Israelites now, at this point, as we're going to pick up here in Numbers, are expecting, their expectation here is to journey to the promised land, right? That's what God's told them. And they were expecting the journey to the promised land to be, they're expecting, the journey to the promised land to be just as nice as they have been promised this land, right? Honey and all this stuff God's going to give. It's going to be a nice, cozy trip up there as well. And of course, as we'll see, when they start to feel some discomfort or some worries, or not what they thought it was going to be, they begin to complain. And God responds here to help us see Him as the gracious giver. Okay, now, as you can see, the first point here, the first kind of overall point of this goes through the first 11 chapters. And just the first point of the first thing here goes through quite a bit of stuff. So I'm not just going to just blow through it, but I am going to just take us through some verses and kind of look at a few things. So if we were to take this book of Numbers, and this is a study, the book of Numbers is a 26-week study on itself. So we're going to kind of hit some of the high points and look at Numbers as in the lessons here, is the I ams that God has been revealing Himself to the Israelites. So this, again, just for some context, just as a timeline for us, Numbers picks up, Israelites are headed to the promised land. They're on the journey here. We kind of got into Leviticus there and looked at some of the laws and stuff, and kind of didn't really talk about where the Israelites were as far as their journey. Numbers picks up, they're headed to the promised land, and they're leaving from Mount Sinai. Okay, so that's where they're at. So they've been given the law there. They've seen the 10 Commandments. They've seen the mount, look like all the things that happened there in Exodus. Numbers now, Moses come down. They've had this Levitical law given to them, and Aaron and the priesthood has been set up and all this stuff. So now they're headed towards the promised land. Leaving from Mount Sinai. Now, the nation of Israel gives an offering to the Lord to support the worship of God, and that's the entirety of chapter 7. Okay, so when we'll get over there, we'll look at a few things. That whole chapter deals with them kind of giving offerings to show support in the worship of God. Priesthood's in place. That's in chapter 8. A brand new tabernacle is being built and celebrated. There's a second Passover that comes in chapter 9, and they are enjoying the presence of God. And we see that because over in chapter 9 as well, verses 15 through 23, specifically, His guiding cloud and pillar of fire are there on the tabernacle, and that's what's using to kind of lead them around. God even institutes a communication system here using 2 silver trumpets, and that's over in chapter 10, and we'll get there too. And there are various signals that came from these 2 silver trumpets, and essentially each tribe had a specific signal that the trumpeters would play on these 2 silver trumpets, or that would be played on these 2 silver trumpets, and that's what it would tell them it was their time to move. Okay, so God set up this communication system, kind of so that way, there's millions of people here. There's a lot of people involved in these tribes, so this was kind of the organized way of getting them to move. Was the communication system used with these trumpets? That way, not everybody was just trying to pick up and take off at one time, because that would never work. That'd be mass chaos. So that was why that was implemented and put into place. Moses also used those trumpets when he needed to assemble the Israelites to tell them something, or to get them together in any way. If you will, go over to chapter 10, and let's go to verse 9. we see a purpose of the trumpets in the promised land. And if ye go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresseth you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered before the Lord your God, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. So anytime they're in the middle of a fight in the promised land, or some enemies showed up, what were they to do? Blow those trumpets, and who was going to come to their aid? God. He's going to come in and wipe them out. So as soon as they had an enemy, all they do is hit the trumpet, and God's going to come in and take care of it. It's a pretty awesome promise right there. That should have been like, all right, we're good. Don't worry about anything. He's going to come in and take care of all of it. All they had to blow, and they wanted to activate God's involvement in their battles. God's going to come to rescue them. Chronologically here, the next chapter in Israel's history is Numbers chapter 7. Okay? The census, which is in Numbers chapters 1 through 6, actually happen after the events of chapters 7 through 10. Okay, let's say that again. Chronologically, so as far as the actual, if you're watching this in a movie, right, you're going to jump to, if we look at the Bible as a movie, we're going to jump to Numbers chapter 7. That's them leaving Mount Sinai to go to the Promised Land. The first 6 chapters is just the census of the nation that takes place after that. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, but that's just the way that it's written down. And you can look down, if you look just in the first chapter there, you get down to about verse 5 or 6, and you start seeing all the names and all the people, as Pastor Rob says, Bubba begat Bubba, so on and so on, and you see that there. And some of those names, I feel like I'm a pretty good pronouncer of biblical words. Some of these names are pretty tough. As I was reading through this week, I would stand up here for 10 minutes and just butcher all those names, and you all just, kind of figure them out too. We won't have to necessarily worry about that, but that's what that is. So just kind of give you a context of where we're at as far as how this stories go, as far this story goes. As you see there in Numbers 10, blowing the horn for the instruction, for the activation of God. And verse 10 of Numbers 10, God would assume here about Israel's future that they're going to worship the Lord with gladness in the Promised Land. So that's why we see God giving Israel the 2 silver trumpets to embolden Israel in battle and to worshipfully respond to God's presence when He's with them in the Promised Land. Okay, the trumpets as well should have been a reassurance of Israel to Israel of God's desire to give them His gracious blessings. Before moving on, though, God had Moses complete a census of the people, and that's what we see in chapter 1. The emphasis was on numbering the men who could go to war. So go to verse 46 of chapter 1. Give us an idea of how many people that Moses is dealing with here. And even all they that were numbered, were 600,000 and 300,000 and 550. Okay, or 3,000. Sorry. So 600,000 and so 603,000, 535 men that were able to go to war. Okay, and then you think, if you just say one woman per one man, that wouldn't have necessarily been the case. There would have been single men there as well. But if you just kind of, for the most part, and then throw kids into the equation as well, and then the elderly men and women who would not have been able to go to war, and then even the younger men who, that were teenagers or whatever, who would not have been able to fight. This was a multitude of people, a mass of people that was traveling through the desert there to head towards the Promised Land. So you can see why God's giving them the trumpets and giving them these orders to make sure things are happening orderly. So that's a ton of people that Moses was in charge of here. We get to chapter 2 of Numbers. God gives them the instructions on how the tribes are to be arranged around the tabernacle. Okay, there was a specific way in which these tribes were to set up camp in the midst of around the tabernacle. God wanted things to be done in a very orderly fashion. Now, God's dwelling place was the hub. All right, it was the hub of the camp. The priests from the tribe of Levi dwelt or stayed between the people and the tabernacle. So in the middle was the tabernacle, around the tabernacle, or in the midst of, on the outside of it would have been the Levites. They would have been between the God and the people. And that, again, symbolized that the Levites, priests, were called of a higher order, essentially the intercessories for the Israelites between God, all right, and them. That's why they would have been there. Moses numbered the Levites and details the responsibilities for each major divisions of the Levites, and that's in chapters 3 and 4 of that. So that's kind of how the first 4 or 5, first 6 chapters go. Moses ends Israel's stay at the Mount Sinai with some more additional instructions, and we see those in chapters 5 through chapter 6. Now, this lesson doesn't call for us to get into that in detail. We may come back to this when we kind of get done with this study and just do a study of the book of Numbers and some of these things, or maybe not. We may go to the New Testament. I haven't decided yet. At some point, though, we'll revisit this as a Sunday school class to kind of get in and dig through this. I think it's kind of interesting. Okay, so that's kind of that's the beginning there of the book of Numbers. And that's what showing their God's blessing on Israel as we look through those things. Now, we are going to go to verse 22 of chapter 6 because we see God's prayer for Israel. This is a benediction that God's going to give to Moses, to give to Aaron and the Levites. And it's got a ton of emotion here and a ton of meaning. Right? There's a lot of interesting things to kind of look at. Now, if you look at how this is written over in Numbers chapter 6, verse 22, this is written kind of like a poem. As a matter of fact, it's more poetic than the other language has been used throughout as Moses has been writing. And the reason it's written in this poetic way is that it's meant to elicit a response from the Israelites. Okay, God's been giving them this instruction after instruction: do this on this day, put the tabernacle up this way, you stay here. Very, very detailed, straightforward instructions. And they've gotten used to getting essentially commandments and directions from God. God says, do this, okay, we'll do this. God changes tone, essentially, right? Makes this more poetic to try to elicit a response from the Israelites. And it reveals this 6-verse prayer reveals God's desire. He has a deep desire to bless Israel. All right, let's read it. Verse 22 down through verse 27. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, saying, On this wise ye shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Okay? His intentions for Israel are always for their good. Everything God has for Israel, while they may sometimes think it's not real good, the intention is always their best interest at heart. Okay? He's always doing things for their good. Beginning with his promises to the patriarchs, the words, and keep thee, as we see, verse 24, the Lord bless thee and keep thee, the words that we see there, that points to God's desire to preserve Israel, just like he promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Just as he promised all of those, he has a desire to preserve Israel so they could enjoy his blessings, not just presently, but for generations and generations to come as well. Particularly here while they're inhabiting the promised land. We see verse 28, the Lord's face shining on Israel is a reference to the Lord's presence with Israel, right? It's how do they know that God is in their midst? They can look over the tabernacle. What do they see at night? See a burning pillar, right? What do they see at day? They see a cloud that they're swirling around. Right, so the phrasing there just shows that God is with them. And is there also a reference to Moses, right? When Moses came down off Mount Sinai and he saw just the sliver, right? He saw God's backside as his presence passed by. For a whole month, Moses' face was what? It's just shining, right? It was shining. So that's another kind of a callback to that for the Israelites to remember and just show what it means to be in the presence of God. Exodus 34, 29 through 35, we see a little instance. We talked about that a little bit. God's presence is going to bring Israel grace and favor. The favors that they would not deserve, they do not deserve, but that God is going to provide for them, and not just provide for them, but he delights. He enjoys blessing his people, right? He's going to delight in providing for them. Now, the emphasis here on this prayer, this benediction in Numbers, the last part of chapter 6, is on the nation of Israel. But the Hebrew here, the translation, the Hebrew pronouns for you are singular, emphasizing a very, very personal nature to this prayer. Right? So while the benediction, the blessing is on the nation of Israel, Moses wrote this. He wrote this using the Hebrew pronoun for individual, for singular. So when each Israelite heard this, he or she would have taken that God is going to do this personally to me. He's going to bless me personally in this way. Just again, showing a more personalized nature to what this prayer, in a much more romantic way of God to kind of chasing after his people, essentially what this is. Okay? Now, the last section of the prayer, verse 26 there, is pretty climatic. It called for the Lord to turn his face towards Israel and to give them peace. Verse 26, the Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Peace communicates what? For the Israelites here. Was on the surface value, peace means what? No war, exactly. On face value, peace means no war. But it does, but he uses that there communicate even more than just the absence of war. The meaning of this is very, very personal because it includes a sense of completeness and a true wellness of the soul, right? And God's peace is on these people. They're not going to have to worry about fighting, but they're going to have an actual wellness of the soul because they know God's in control and he's going to bless them continually because of this. The peace is going to come as a result of God's attention. He's going to turn his face on the Israelites. They know that he is in charge and he's going to care for them and bless them. We talked about all in the previous verses of this prayer. So it gives a satisfaction to the Israelites' souls because they know that he's looking upon them and taking care of all of their needs. Okay? Lift up his countenance that we see there. Again, in verse 26, it's the exact same concept as him essentially looking at him and smiling at him. Right? Pippa, she's getting to where she's just doing funny stuff. And there's times where I look at her and she does something and we just giggle at her because she just does funny things. She's at that age. This is, and you can kind of, get a little sense of, kind of well up in you a little bit because you're proud of her and how much you love her and all this. Same idea, same concept. He's looking down at his kids and they're doing something silly or whatever. And he's just giving them a smile, giving them a satisfaction. And we see the satisfaction of being able to bless his children here. Okay? Delighted in giving Israel gracious gifts. So as the priests are praying this prayer, giving this benediction, just like the Lord has prescribed, the Lord would identify himself with his people and bless them. Okay? So as you see that benediction, as you see that prayer, give me three words, three kind of summary words of that prayer. What are they? Anybody? I'm going to give you one. Peace. It's another one. Blessing and grace. Peace, blessing, and grace. Kind of the three summary words of what God is going to, has prescribed here for the Israelites. God's going to provide for Israel's needs, just as he promised that he would. And he promises his blessings on them going forward. But it was what God chose to provide for Israel that eventually led them to their complaining and their belly aching about stuff. He desired them to be content and rejoicing, especially as they looked ahead to the wonderful blessings they're hearing about, they're getting ready to receive of the promised land and all the things that are in it. Israel, though, as we see over in Numbers 11, they pretty much become disappointed almost immediately. So let's go over to Numbers chapter 11. And let's look at the first 3 verses. And when the people, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And the people cried unto Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. Reading Numbers kind of chronologically helps show the stark contrast between the Lord's desires to bless Israel, and in that we saw in the priestly benediction, and Israel's immediate rebellion against him as they leave Sinai. Okay, the people complain here on just their 3rd day of traveling, and when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and we can see pretty upset in what he did because of it. So just on their 3rd day of their journey, they're complaining. Now, why Israel is complaining here, don't really know. Doesn't really matter as far as kind of how this looks. It's much more important knowing that their complaining displeased God. It's been 3 days out. It's not been that long ago. And we see a great dissatisfaction with God with the Israelites. We have pretty kind of a tantamount expression of God's wrath on them for their complaining and their dissatisfaction with him. So in his displeasure of their complaining, I can just hear it. I mean, I can just imagine the stuff that was being said. Oh, it's too hot. Oh, I'm so thirsty. I mean, you can imagine people complaining, how people are quickly and will start to complain. We see that because of their displeasure, God sends a fire to the outskirts of Israel's camp and actually burns up some of the Israelites, right? Verse 1, the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. So the outer skirts of the camp, I would imagine just spontaneously stuff caught on fire. Just the way it reads. And it burnt some of them up. And in the midst of this, verse 2, we see the people crying out unto Moses, and then Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So this fire is raging, people's stuff's getting burnt, people are getting burnt, and the Israelites cry out to Moses. Moses prays, and as soon as Moses prays to the Lord, we see, boom, the fire turns off. Which I think would be a pretty eye-opening experience if you were somebody who was around that and saw that take place. All of a sudden there's fire, then it's just gone. I think that would be pretty eye-opening. The place then, of course, was called Taberah, which literally means burning. Now, while we don't really know why Israel is complaining at Taberah here, we can surmise that they have some type of dissatisfaction with the circumstances they're in. Obviously, they've got camp set up, so they've been traveling all day 3, and they've got camp set up, and then they're belly aching about something. And dissatisfied with their circumstances. I guess they could imagine being in better circumstances, or maybe even in a better place. Maybe they wanted God just to apparate them into the promised land, whatever the case may be. I don't know. That God had chosen not to provide them with what they thought were their best circumstances. Okay? Not what they thought could have imagined would have been good. And why do you suppose God didn't provide the very best for Israel while they're in the wilderness? Why do you think God didn't just give them the Taj Mahal the whole time they were traveling? He could have, right? I mean, he very easily could have done that. Why do you think he maybe didn't give them the very best while they were in the wilderness?
Why would they want to leave?
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's really. Why would they want to leave if they have something good? That's a really good point. He wanted.
Supposed to be.
No, that's supposed to be. He wanted their focus to be on what? the destination, or the end part, not the journey, right? He wanted them to focus on the blessings of the promised land, and then therefore wanted them to continue to look forward to the ultimate blessing being with him in the promised land. He didn't want the trip to be nice and cozy, because then why would they want to get in there, right? That's exactly right. The wilderness was not Israel's final destination. God didn't promise them a wilderness that was flowing with milk and honey. That blessing, of course, was for the promised land, and that's what awaited them at the end of the journey. So just 3 days into this now, and we're going to leave the Israelites here for today. Just 3 days into this, we see them already being dissatisfied with God, and God having to come down on them with some judgment because of that. Next week, we'll get to verse 4 and pick up Israel here now craving meat. And then again, this now, at this point, literally becomes a vicious circle. Dissatisfaction, complaining, judgment, God provides. They move. Dissatisfaction, complaining, judgment, God provides. They move. And it kind of happens over and over and over again. And to the point where God makes them, of course, we know, wander around in the wilderness for much longer than they initially were going to, because of their dissatisfaction with them. And we'll get into that more and more as we kind of continue to move through the book of Numbers here next week and the weeks to come. All right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for, again, the lessons that we have and being able to study the nation of Israel and all their faults. And while this is incorporated into Scripture for the reader and for us, I honestly think it gives us a representation of what it means to interject what our wants are and what our will is into what we think you should do for us. I think this is here for a record of what happened, and being able to read what happened and how you took care of Israel. But I also believe it's been incorporated in the Scriptures for us to read as an object lesson. It's purely an object lesson of what not to do, and the dangers of wanting more or wanting other than what you have for us, Lord. I mean, complaining about it and being dissatisfied, or whatever the case may be, Lord. So as we continue to look through this, as we continue to move with the nation of Israel here through the wilderness and the vicious circle that we're going to see, Lord, I pray that it's a reminder to us that you have already blessed us with far, 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 far more than we deserve. If you just went to Calvary, that would have been enough. I pray it's a reminder to us, Lord, as well, to be satisfied with what you've blessed us with. Lord, I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes the next little bit, as he use him more than